We are going to be discussing reading development and causes of reading disabilities this week. So, to begin, the emergent literacy period, and they're basing this off of the Charles stages of reading development, but we'll get into a little bit later about Charles stages and how stages are not exactly the best use for understanding reading development, but it's helpful to exemplify the state the process of reading development as it goes through. But obviously, reading development is much more complicated than just a simple stage model can incorporate. So, emergent literacy period. This is birth to kindergarten, and it occurs before children go to school. And it's discussing the literacy knowledge acquired depends on the amount of exposure and the child's interest and facility in learning. So, we've been talking about these children from low SES backgrounds or culturally deprived backgrounds. They're not getting a lot of emergent literacy experience. And that's not to say they can't be taught that once they get to school, but these children's experiences in regards to literacy are vastly different than children's from the middle class backgrounds. It would be like taking a child out of an African country where there is no one literate and placing them in a kindergarten classroom and expecting them to perform at the same level as their same age peers. It's just, they're not equivalent because these children aren't growing up in literacy enriched backgrounds. So while the research is variant about the effect the emergent literacy period has on reading development, we know when in regards to children from culturally deprived backgrounds, it's critical. So you have to take this into consideration of, is this a child who came from a background where they had emergent literacy or were they deprived of it? So when it comes to literacy socialization, you're looking at three different types of literacy socialization. Literacy artifacts, and these are everywhere, as the book talks about. You have nursery rhymes and you have thematic nurseries, and that you might have Noah's Ark all over the nursery. You might have Peter Rabbit or any other type of artifact that's literacy related. Characters from nursery rhymes decorating walls, sheets and cribs, and just everywhere there's something that's physically there as an artifact, as a literacy event. Books obviously are little literacy artifacts. A good example, pens and papers. Cecile is picking up pens. I was in a store today and she picked up a pen and my friend goes, "Oh my goodness, she's holding the pen the right way." I said, "Oh, well, that's probably just random." But she did pick up a pen, knew the function of a pen, and was trying to write with the pen on the paper that was in front of her. Of course, it doesn't have to be paper. She sees a pen and she wants to write with it anywhere she goes. But she knows the function of a pen and that it's used to write. And of course, she's getting a lot of exposure of that from her big sister in addition to her mom. So that's an example of literacy artifact. Now, a literacy event and literacy experiences we're going to talk about more extensively. So a literacy event would be joint book reading. These are instructionally organized literacy events. There's a parent focus there, or adult focus really. Studies have found that parents, when they're doing joint book reading, focus on meaning and comprehension. They're not necessarily drawing a lot of attention to labeling. They're not even picking books based on their rhythm and rhymings. They're just picking books in general. So as the infants grow older, the parents shift their focus and introduce more input that's more cognitively demanding. I'm sorry, y'all, it's late. So you move from the very simple books that have a rhythm and a pattern to things that may not be rhyming books. But again, the research showed that there wasn't a dominance of a rhyming preference versus non-rhyming preference in book reading when it came to parents. But if you look at books that are offered for infants and toddlers, they generally follow a rhyming pattern. Goodnight Moon, Time for Bed, Pookie. I'm thinking of ones that we read to Cecile. They all have a rhyming pattern, even if they're little flap books, Where is Baby's Belly Button, or there are other books similar to that where they have to pull something down and find behind the flap, an object behind the flap. that is still in the rhyming pattern, and they're not cognitively demanding. I mean, the books can be as simple, though, as just one word pictures per page. Those are often used in early childhood as well. So, but as parents, they typically tend to focus on meaning and comprehension. And then there are types of parent questions that parents are doing when they're reading to stories. And the types of questions and explanations that they're developing include what explanations, reason explanations, and effective explanations. So when children learn to respond to these kinds of questions, it prepares them for the types of questions they're going to be required to respond to when they get to the school level. Now, good parents or good language-based parents can modify their questions and scaffold to their children to based on what their child is able to do. And of course, other parents who don't know how to develop children's language or don't instinctively know that practice because that's not necessarily the type of language that they're used to, the language environment they're in, can be taught how to modify their questions and scaffold answers, like we talked about last semester. In addition, children learn how to ask questions about text based on the scripts and schemas that they're presented throughout this joint book reading experience. So your children are getting a lot of exposure to the components of print and book conventions. You learn these little squiggly lines, these straight lines, these circles. They must represent something, and that because the palm's following that, and it never changes. It's always the same on every page, no matter what. That repetition of books is critical too, because the children can begin to recognize the pattern. And I can remember Kennedy beginning to predictively read Polar Bear, what do you hear? And or the other one is Brown Bear, what do you see? She wasn't reading those words, but she memorized the predictive pattern of the books of that it's a different animal, and based on the animal on the page, she would know what animal said, lion, what do you hear? Then she would turn to the next page to see what they heard. So I hear an elephant roaring in my ear. I hear an ostrich. She would know to flip to the next page to find out what the prediction of the text was. And I think she was doing that when she was 2 years old. So that's the exposure to components of Britain book conventions, as well as left to right progression, front to back. So the importance of book reading, though, joint book reading, is controversial in literature because there's no established link that you have to have joint book reading to be a good reader. In other words, the absence of joint book reading does not equivalent to a reading disability. But again, there are so many other factors to consider when you're looking at reading disabilities overall and what contributes to that. We know that children from culturally deprived backgrounds or culturally different backgrounds can be taught to read effectively and become fluent readers in spite of the lack of literacy exposure. We may never be able to make up for the vocabulary deficits they come in to school with, but they can be taught how to read. So that means that the joint book reading isn't carrying as much weight as other components of reading development. But at the same time, it's still a critical element of reading development and needs to be taught and developed as much as it can be before school starts, particularly in preschool environments and with early childhood educators, because the more joint book reading they do, the more exposure they have, the less likely they will be at risk, the more likely they are to learn to read, given that all the other components are in place for reading acquisition. But there's also a lot of evidence that supports that a positive attitude and motivation are more of a key to learning to read than joint book reading. So essentially, these children have to be motivated to read and have positive attitude in association with reading. So now the emergent literacy period, learning about print. So even though joint book reading is controversial, we know, like I was saying before, it facilitates and contributes to learning letter names, shapes, and sounds. So just being exposed to it, just seeing it, increases that awareness. Letter recognition and speed are important because of the intentional resources used for retrieval. So the better a child is at being able to know, oh, that B says B, and that G says G every single time, that's less facilities that you need to use to retrieve that sound whenever they're reading, because look at this text that's in front of you and how many different letters there are. If you have to use part of your facilities to just retrieve the letter name or the sound, it's going to take you forever to read the word letter. And you're never going to comprehend what you're reading because it takes so much work just to sound it out letter by letter and sound by sound. So essentially, in this learning about print stage, early phonological awareness develops. And this is even as simple as nursery rhyme awareness and the interest in rhyming, awareness of onset rhymes. That leads to the awareness of all sounds. In fact, rhyming is the first phonological awareness skill. And then it leads into the sentence segmenting into words. So in the sentence, my name is Rachel, that's 4 words. My name is Rachel. If we could move to the sentence syllable segmentation, my name is Rachel, that's 5 syllables. And then you move from the syllables into the word level, or of how many syllables in a word. And then only from after that level can you move to the sounds in a word. So it's a progression. It goes up a step ladder, as we say. And rhyming is the first step to say, okay, yeah, cat and bat. And that's why that interest in rhyming is so peaked in the early childhood, is because it's rhythmic and it's fun, and they pay a lot of attention to that. And again, that's why I typically choose rhyming books and stories for Cecile in her early literacy stage, because that holds her interest more than The Giving Tree, a book that Kennedy and I read yesterday, that has no rhythmic pattern, really is high level cognitively, lots of inferential meaning in that story, not a story that she's really even understanding at this point as a 6-year-old of all the implications of that story. So much less something that Cecile would be interested in hearing. So because phonological awareness instruction doesn't occur until kindergarten, because again, when they come into kindergarten, they're not expected to know how to read or expected to have all these skills, but children with preschool experience do have more phonological awareness skills and are better at this than children without preschool experience. But because it doesn't occur, the instruction doesn't occur officially until kindergarten, some children may not show adequate phoneme awareness until 1st grade. Now take that into consideration in our state, where we're requiring all of kindergartners be screened for dyslexia by the end of kindergarten, and then all of 1st graders be screened at the beginning of 1st grade. And the majority of the dyslexia screeners being used is up to the discretion of the district, but from what I've seen being used, it's completely phonological awareness. In fact, the definitions in the law, all the components are phonological awareness. So if we know from the research and developmentally speaking about how reading develops, and that we can't develop the skill until we've been instructed in it, is it appropriate for us to screen children at the end of kindergarten if they've never been instructed completely in phonological awareness? Because this screener that I've seen is screening them in phoneme manipulation tasks, which really are not developmentally appropriate until the mid to end of 1st grade. So that's something to be mindful of as you go into the field as a practitioner, potentially in schools especially, that this is a law, this is required, but does that necessarily make it appropriate? Because our laws and our policies are what govern us, what we must adhere to, but it's not always what's appropriate or adequate, and it's up to us as the professionals to advocate for the best practices in our profession. So my little side bit about that dyslexia in our state. Then moving on, language ability includes abstract notions of temporal, spatial, and causal relationships that contribute to early literacy development. So essentially, you can't put aside all the language components that are playing into the learning about print in the emergent literacy period. But we do know that limited literacy experience does not mean that the child will be a slow learner. But they will be at risk for reading difficulties. Again, that's going into those children from the culturally deprived or diverse backgrounds. So the risk is reduced. I put this in bold, high caps. High quality preschool. High quality preschool reduces your risk for reading deficits because you can teach that phonological awareness skills earlier. You can teach emergent literacy skills earlier. You can teach joint book reading earlier in high quality preschool. But again, a lot of the preschool systems that are in place may not be high quality in regards to language learning environments. They're hitting the alphabet. They sing the alphabet ABC song. Whether the phoneme grapheme correspondence is adequate is really questionable, because even in schools with certified teachers, you're getting ba and ka and da, that schwa ending. And preschools are usually certified by not by the State Department of Education or a bachelor's degree, but some type of degree in early childhood, may or may not be bachelor's. In addition to that, the language environments aren't necessarily that strong. They might focus on the pre-primer adult sight words. Well, that's not necessarily appropriate to those early childhood settings because it's not hitting their developmental levels. It's too high for them, and it's not based in context. So it's also a critical role for you if you go into early childhood or in early preschool settings in schools to be an advocate and a proponent and the expert in early childhood development in regards to language and literacy and what's appropriate, what's not, and how do we create high quality preschool programs to develop these literacy skills. Okay, so then we move on from early literacy until development of word recognition skills. So we know proficient readers can recognize words accurately and with little effort. Accurate and effortless word recognition requires both the knowledge of letter sequences and the ability to use a direct visual route without phonological mediation to access semantic memory and word meaning. In other words, you don't sound out letter by letter, sound by sound. You automatically go to that when you see the word ability. You know that ability says ability without going ability. So, but you have to start at the knowledge of letter sequences. That's where your starting point is, for the beginning. And then you move into the direct visual route without the phonological mediation. So mature readers, like yourselves, don't need to break down a word unless it's an unfamiliar word. And even when you come to an unfamiliar word, you're not breaking it down sound by sound. You're usually breaking it down by patterns or familiarity with other words you know. So there are the stage models. They represent reading development, but they are inadequate. This is just going to give us a general helicopter view idea of how reading develops. It's good to use in conversations about reading development, about what's appropriate, what's not, but it's inadequate because it doesn't cover all of the complexity of reading development. So stage models. The first stage being the logographic model. And that might be a word you might not be familiar with, so you decode it, but you don't decode it you know graphic, and you know logo, so you probably put together logographic. And that's just an example of that ways we learn to read. We'll get to that self-teaching hypothesis in a minute. Selma said prophecy. That wouldn't be right. All right, logographic stage is the end of emergent literacy. So the end of that joint book reading, and okay, I kind of know what a book does and what is telling me a story. And in the transition into the phonetic stage, they can construct associations between unanalyzed spoken words and one or more salient graphic features of the printed word, such as you see the McDonald's sign and you see that M, and you know that M stand, that those arches are McDonald's. And the book uses the example of Coca-Cola and Rice Krispies, that you see a label and you associate it with what the word is, even if the initial letter doesn't match, because you're associating the label and the symbol and the visual features of it more so than the letter that's associated with it. So you don't use knowledge of letter names or sound letter relationships to recognize words. And children, they do show that children do not need to read logographically to begin to read phonetically. You can skip the logographic phase, for instance, if you're one of those children from that not very literacy enriched backgrounds. So the logographic stage goes pretty quick, usually beginning of school, right before school starts. So kindergarten is really when you're starting the alphabetic stage. They begin to read words by processing sound letter correspondence. And you don't put ages. I want to back up for a second because I said kindergarten is where this should be, but you needed to consider the wide range of kindergarten abilities. A child who's walking into kindergarten with an August 28th birthday as age 4, turning 5 at the end of August is very different from your September 1st or September 2nd birthday that they'll turn 6 September 2nd developmentally. And that's the wide range of ages that you are teaching in kindergarten. So you need to be considerate of these developmental stages when it comes to not only the grade level progressions and what the grade level expectations are, but also the age expectations of some children are not ready to read and move into these stages until they're much more mature in their development. And you just can't deny it. And if you go into schools, you will see exactly what I mean, but they might change the start date of school by that time, because on the legislative agenda this year, they had it changed and they revoked it, where the school start date for a child to enroll in kindergarten, their birthday had to be August 1st instead of September 1st, which would have eliminated any child starting kindergarten at age 4. But it didn't go through. That's not to say it's not going to go through at a later time. So it's something to be keeping in mind. So ages, when you say kindergarten, that age range could be very wide ranging. And that's a little different than our thinking about standardized testing measures when you talk about curriculum versus standardized testing. Okay, so Airy has 4 stages of the alphabetic stage. You had the pre-alphabetic, which was the logographic stage, the partial alphabetic, full alphabetic, and consolidated alphabetic. So the children use sound letter correspondence to decode novel words or new words. They must realize that the sounds make up spoken words, which is phonological awareness. But that's keeping in mind, too, that sound letter correspondence is an abstract linguistic process, so they must be taught this. It needs to be explicitly taught. It can't just be something that they are assumed to be getting because they're exposed to it. So there is a lack of correspondence, too, between sounds and letters in English. We know that all of the 44 phonemes in English, as it says in the next bullet, are represent 251 different spellings, or represented by 251 different spellings. That is a lot of different spellings for 44 sounds. It's also critical to keep in mind that invented spelling indicates phonological awareness. So if you have a child spelling a word like it sounds, like truck spelled C-H-U-K, that actually sounds like truck, even though as a reader, you know that's not how it's spelled. You need to make into, particularly when you come into the assessment component of reading disabilities, you need to take into consideration allophonic features and how our phonemes are influenced by the surrounding phonemes. It uses the alveolar flaps as an example of the variations of the T and the D, and the glottals. But we also know, too, as speech is strung together in sentences and conversation, that there's even less correspondence between sounds and letters because the effects of co-articulation are greater incidences in conversational speech. So you must keep that in mind, that not only is there a lack of correspondence between sounds and letters in English, that our allophonic features, as our speech changes based on the co-articulation and the surrounding sounds, makes it even more difficult to distinguish between sounds. But if the child is doing invented spelling, though, that's a good sign because that shows good phonological awareness. If they're just stringing some random letters together, that's a very big red flag as an educator. So again, 251 different spellings for 44 English phonemes. And we know orthographic knowledge is necessary to develop automatic, effortless sight word recognition. We're not going to become effortless without the orthographic knowledge. So we move from alphabetic stage into the orthographic stage in automatic sight word recognition. So that's when you move from going sound by sound to the use of letter sequences and spelling patterns to recognize words by sight without phonological decoding, without sound by sound. So you use a direct visual route without phonological mediation to access semantic memory and word meaning. What's crucial here, the key word here rather, is sight word. Because sight words, when you're talking about sight words, exposing children to sight words, they're sight words because they don't follow phonological patterns. I've used the example before of said, S-A-I-D. That doesn't follow any other phonological pattern in English. You just have to memorize it. And so those words essentially start at level 3 of the automatic sight word recognition. Children may start it at the alphabetic stage and try to decode it, but they're not going to be able to decode it correctly because they don't follow phonological patterns. Typically, that's why they're sight words. But ultimately, every word becomes a sight word because you move to that automatic process. So this begins when children accumulate sufficient knowledge of spelling patterns so they recognize words visually. Orthographic knowledge accumulates as readers develop, and the more exposure they have, the better readers are going to be. Morphemes are easy patterns to start with, so ing, ly, ed, s. And then you can have patterns of words that share letter sequences. The book uses mountain and fountain as an example, so there's only one phoneme difference between those two words. DGE words are another example, like edge and ledge and wedge. Anything that follows a specific pattern in the same sequence of letters. TION, which that's the morpheme. Those are all good examples of patterns of the sight word recognition that mature readers begin to compile. So knowledge of letters sequences enables readers to set up access routes in memory to automatically retrieve it rather than go through all the different levels of memory to sound it out sound by sound. So children rely less heavily on higher level knowledge sources as their word recognition becomes more modularized. So the modular theory here was that it has a functional autonomy and is cognitively impenetrable. It's one that operates quickly and is not controlled or influenced by higher level processes. So modularization essentially is automaticity. And as I was typing this, Kennedy was in here and she was talking to me, and she had been reading, and we were talking about reading. And so we're talking about how you get to that automatic sight word recognition. I said, well, okay, let me do a little experiment with you. So I typed this word, and she reads it, come. I said, okay, now read this word. She said, overcome. Even though I know she's never seen that word, or if she has limited exposure to it. I said, okay. She said, become. And she takes a pause or a second to try to put it together. And then I said, maybe that one. And she said, come back. And so when she was reading it, she was decoding it by that sight word recognition, the automatic memory. She wasn't trying to sound out come by itself because she had that automatic phonological retrieval. Now, if I had thrown in some other words besides just come, like back, or I'm blanking now on some other examples of some sight words that she might have had. But I know because was one of her word wild words, but become was not. But she recognized the be and she recognized the come, so she was able to decode it automatically. So she's at this level of decoding to a certain extent. Now, she definitely comes across words sometimes that she needs to phonologically decode sound by sound. But there's a certain element of her reading that has that automatic sight word recognition. So how do readers get to that point? That moves us into the stage theory versus self-teaching hypothesis. So the problems with stage theory is it focuses on what children need to become proficient readers and not the mechanisms that underlie the changes in reading proficiency. There's a wide range of what readers are doing at these different stages. For instance, like I was saying with Kennedy, to a certain extent, she's at orthographic stage. But at the same time, she's also still at alphabetic stage because she doesn't recognize all the phonics patterns. She hasn't been taught all of them yet. So if she comes to the digraphs and the diphthongs, particularly the diphthongs of O-I or O-Y or O-U, she's not automatically going to be able to decode those because she just hasn't had enough exposure to them. She's had a lot of exposure to CVC, so CVC are in this automatic stage, but the other types of phonics patterns are not. So there's a wide range. You can be in multiple stages at the same time, but that stage theory doesn't account for that. The stage has each stage is associated with only one type of reading. And it oversimplifies the development and obscures individual differences because, of course, every child's going to be different. So some theorists came up with a self-teaching hypothesis. And this seems to fit into reading as better as a definition, and that phonological decoding functions as a self-teaching mechanism that enables the learner to acquire the detailed orthographic representations necessary for fast and accurate visual word recognition and proficient spelling. In other words, what Kennedy was doing is the self-teaching. She's seen the word come enough times to be able to access that route without phonologically decoding every word that has the word come in it. But children, they don't become proficient readers by guessing, by context, because context is not a good predictor. It says at the top of page 37 that sorry, let me find it. 35. Context is a false friend because it helps you when you least need it. That the average predictability of words when they were deleted was 29.5%. So you're not going to be, the ability for children to determine a word based on context is not, essentially children aren't going to determine words based on context because the context is not enough of a clue, whether it's through the visual context of the pictures or the rest of the sentence. And essentially, if you do it statistically, the context isn't enough. So they're combining the context with the word recognition and proficiency and phonological decoding and automatic sight word recognition to determine unknown words based on context. It's not the context of the sentence, but rather all those components working together. And the author says he read somewhere a long time ago that the transition to fluent, proficient decoding is like magic. And I can't help but reiterate that because I saw it this year with Kennedy. We went from one day of phonologically decoding every single word that we encountered to just the next day we were just reading. We were reading at our text level. Now, granted, not extreme large print, but at the level that we were of readers we were being sent home, those early readers, level 1, level 2, we just were reading them fluently. And I didn't know how that transition happened or when it happened because it seemed to be overnight. And like he's saying, it seems like magic. I would teach words that were unknown and use the context of the word saying, okay, yeah, when you see OU that says ow. But it just happens. And so the self-teaching hypothesis seems to account for that in that the child forms enough phonological memory and sight word recognition based on exposure that they teach themselves to read fluently. And it seems to fit from my personal experience with reading. But who knows if it's the right one. But it will, and you'll see with either your own children one day or children you're working with. One day, the light bulb just comes on, so to speak. You'll hear teachers say that often, and they just become readers. So there's features of phonological decoding in the self-teaching hypothesis. Item-based as opposed to stage-based role of decoding development. This method of decoding by phonology or recognizing by sight depends on how often a child has been exposed to a word. So the more exposure, essentially, the more familiar a child will be with the word. The early onset, the children do not need accurate phonological decoding skills to develop orthographic-based representations. And that's true because we know children can learn sight words or even learn how to read before general explicit reading instruction takes place. The progressive lexicalization of word recognition. So early sound letter correspondence becomes lexicalized to be associated with particular words. And then the rules are used to bootstrap the complex lexically constrained knowledge of spelling sound relationships that characterize the proficient reader. Essentially, like the example before, mountain, fountain example. So you recognize the spelling sound patterns. And then finally, the asymmetric relationship between primary phonological and secondary orthographic components in the self-teaching process. Children try to find larger phonological units to decode, which is essentially phonics instruction, and but goes beyond phonics because there are larger and larger patterns that you form with the more words you have, the more familiar you are. Like metalinguistic, for example. Meta, linguistic, and putting together. These are large words that are really not difficult for you to decode phonetically because you're familiar with those larger lexical units. So, but essentially, phonological decoding is no guarantee of self-teaching. There's a lot of room for individual differences, and this needs to be looked at as a continuum. And like I was saying with Kennedy, she's on a continuum. She's on a high end for her exposure and her sight word recognition right now. Her phonics knowledge is maybe in the middle range because she hasn't had that, again, full exposure and explicit phonics instruction. So as she gets that, she'll become an even more fluent reader and better at decoding those larger unknown words. And I was really experimenting with her the other day, showing her some of these things that I was typing and saying, okay, read the use of letter, and then I would try to get her to sound word attack sequences. But of course, sequences is such a large word to word attack, and the QU pattern not being as familiar because there has not been much exposure to it. That was more difficult. So it's fun being a teacher of reading sometimes when you have an emergent reader. Same with language too. So the self-teaching hypothesis and reading comprehension. The research of the self-teaching hypothesis is relatively new, only proposed about 15 years ago. So the research has shown that phonological decoding was critical to the acquisition of word-specific orthographic representations. It has also shown that spelling is a powerful self-teaching tool in the formation of word-specific orthographic representations. But children's general language competence and experience-based episodic knowledge may have more of an impact on sight word reading than deep semantic knowledge. So language absolutely plays a part in this. To the extent and degree we're not completely sure, but this theory seems to account more for the variance in language and reading development than the simple stage theories do. So now, development of reading comprehension. So we know that children need to understand vocabulary and implicit knowledge of syntactic form to comprehend sentences and text. And Halen, this goes back into your question that you asked earlier in the Hangout about that specific comprehension deficit versus the mixed reading and decoding. So when you're talking about developing reading comprehension in relation to the specific comprehension deficit, comprehension is just solely that specific comprehension deficit is solely in those children who only have difficulties with understanding what they're learning. So Chall classifies this as his third stage, the reading to learn stage, transition to reading more sophisticated text. However, every single book you ever read or are exposed to, you're learning from. So children learn from books well before they begin to read. So it doesn't really fit. What he really is saying is that when you're reading to learn, you're fitting into more of those social studies, sciences, and garnering all the information from the text rather than the oral presentation from the teacher. But we're always learning from books even before we're actually reading books. So for this, linguistic processing is critical. They must have good linguistic skills. And we also know that comprehension of expository texts, such as social studies, science, very content-specific texts, lag behind comprehension of narrative texts. But essentially, listening to me do this lecture is probably a little bit easier than trying to comprehend the information from reading the book. And comprehending a text of a novel, such as Gone Girl, is probably a lot more simplistic and easier to comprehend than language and reading disabilities because of the text level and the vocabulary level and the linguistic level of what we're trying to comprehend. So comprehensions vary based on the types of text that you're reading. Unfortunately, standardized testing of comprehension, it consists of closed type questions. It's usually multiple choice or fill in the blank. Their answering doesn't mean comprehension questions about understanding particular words, sentences, paragraphs, or chapters. A standardized test measure comprehension of plot, purpose, theme, character motives, or author's intent. They typically miss the ability of the child to construct an analytic and creative interpretation of the text. But reading comprehension development must address language development, background knowledge, metacognitive skills, reasoning skills, and how they can explain and justify their aesthetic responses to text they're feeling. And Common Core is moving towards this. The Common Core texts they're supposed to analyze two different types of text and draw conclusions based on the text that they're exposed to, and find arguments and supportive support for their arguments and for their positions based on the text, and citing specific areas in the text where they find the support for their position. Well, this is going to be very difficult for students who aren't used to or haven't been taught how to do this in their writing skills, but it's supposed to be rolling out next year, so we'll see how they do on this. So what are the misconceptions about comprehension development? The ability to construct meanings of different texts cannot develop incrementally because the thinking and reasoning processes used to construct meaning are content or subject specific. Again, reading this text versus Gone Girl or some other popular novel is going to be a different comprehension level. So one of the best predictors of comprehension is familiarity with content knowledge domains. The misconception is comprehension is a unitary, easily measured skill. It's not. It's very complicated. So many texts have more than one right answer. And this text, for example, is a perfect exhibit in that not every researcher in dyslexia is going to agree with their positions on the causes of dyslexia. So there's more than one answer because things aren't just black and white all the time. So what are some strategies of some good comprehenders? How do we know what good comprehenders do? They use what they know. They self-question to establish what they don't know and what they want and need to know. They integrate information across text, add information by making inferences to build cohesion, and use structure to organize their comprehension. They monitor their reading, and they respond thoughtfully to what they read. So if we know this is what good comprehenders do, then it's essentially our job to teach these strategies and these skills to the poor comprehenders. So comprehension performance will vary in bold, capitalized, based on the reader's background knowledge, interest level, the type of comprehension response required, and other reader and text factors. You give me a text about a car and mechanics, and I will be a kindergarten level reader. I will not understand or comprehend any of that information. Economics, way beyond my comprehension level. Give me a text about linguistics and language, I'm at the highest level of comprehension because of my extensive background knowledge in it. So, and my interest level. I'm not interested in learning about mechanics or how to change a tire. And I use that example because Kennedy asked me today, Mama, what makes that radio go in the car? I said, well, it's the car. She said, well, does it have a battery? I said, well, yeah, the car has a battery. I said, but the car also has gas. So I said, I really don't know what makes the car go. So it's amazing what kinds of questions will come up with your children, things that you don't know, because no one knows everything. So that draws the conclusion to our reading development chapter. So let's go into the causes of reading disabilities. We know now how it develops. So what causes the development to go off track? The book discusses briefly extrinsic causes of reading disabilities. And we know a true reading disability is not going to have an extrinsic cause, an exterior cause. It's going to be intrinsic. But at the same time, children need exposure to print, explicit instruction in how print works, and opportunities to practice their reading skills. Unfortunately, researchers and practitioners, and hey, we're the practitioners, me, you, our colleagues, any SLP out there is a practitioner. They have paid limited attention to whether poor readers have met this criteria of having adequate instruction in reading. All right. Now, I want to emphasize that. I'm going to emphasize that a lot. But I'm seeing a lot of kids, too many, come to school with diagnoses of dyslexia who haven't had adequate instruction in reading or adequate time in reading development to determine whether they've had adequate reading instruction. So people are basically essentially giving a test and giving the diagnosis without going further in the diagnostics to see, with adequate instruction and treatment, does the child learn and therefore subsequently not meet the criteria for reading disability. So again, if you walk away with nothing else from this class, know that adequate instruction is a critical criteria for reading disability. So because the research has been limited, the full extent of limited literacy experiences is unknown. And of course, you're factoring all those other factors of lack of vocabulary knowledge and culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. So there's a whole lot of factors there that can play into limited literacy experience. In regards to early literacy experience, as we talked about before, joint book reading accounts for only about 8% of the variance in reading outcome measures. So essentially, you're not going to have a lot of children who did not receive joint book reading who end up being reading disabled. It's a very small percentage that joint book reading affects a child's reading ability. But we do know that lack of early literacy experience is detrimental to children with other risk factors, like I was saying, the low literacy exposure, culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. You factor that in with lack of literacy exposure, and they're at higher risk. Well, look at the children in our state. They pretty much all fit that category. I know most of the children that are falling into the risk factors at my school fit that category of lack of literacy experience early on. And they have other risk factors such as low SES and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So, chicken or egg, so to speak, kind of argument there. In regards to reading instruction, now we have RTI, response to intervention, in place now, and it may be able to eliminate instructional inadequacies. Again, may, because you have to ensure that the RTI that's being used is effective and appropriate and being changed to meet the children's needs. But differences in instruction do make a difference in whether or not children become reading disabled. And a study by the Valentino and his colleagues found that after remedial instruction, 67% of the poor readers scored in the average or above average range on test reading achievement. That's a tremendous increase from the percentage of children that were at risk or had reading deficits. They improved almost 70% of the population just by teaching them adequately. Then there's a lot that can be said and done at the regular education instructional level to make these children good readers. But we do know that children with phonological processing deficits or other intrinsic deficiencies may also benefit from instruction. So it doesn't just help those children who have the extrinsic factors that make them higher risk, but it also helps the children who have what we know as the intrinsic factors of the phonological awareness deficit. So adequate instruction is key. And then finally, the Matthew effects. We've talked extensively about how the vocabulary of children with reading disabilities progressively slows in growth and becomes weaker, not because necessarily they have vocabulary deficits or disorders, but because they're not reading, and you learn new vocabulary through reading once you reach the school age. So that's one Matthew effect. But there's also, we need to give consideration that children might have, even considering children for reading disabilities can have negative consequences. And the authors refer to it as the swamp. Once they get bogged down in the swamp of being at risk or not being good readers, they could stay there forever. You can't work your way out of the swamp. And there can be negative outcomes of putting children at risk for reading disabilities or labeling them with reading disabilities, such as low expectations, limited practice, and poor motivation. So all of these factors can contribute to the child essentially becoming reading disabled because they did not have expectations that were high enough for them. They didn't have enough practice in reading. And of course, just being labeled with that, it gave them poor motivation. And then finally, it talks about children who don't read much fall behind in language development because the language grows more complex as the reading becomes more complex and deeper vocabulary knowledge is there. So intrinsic causes of reading disabilities. And there's a lot of different theories out there about what causes a child to be reading disabled. And again, it's kind of a chicken or egg argument a lot of times. Which was first? Were these deficits there before? Before they were born? Or did they acquire those deficits because they never learned how to read adequately? So we're going to discuss the different intrinsic differences in children with reading disabilities. The first being a genetic basis. So it has been shown that reading disabilities runs in families, and they did find that in studies of identical twins, 68% of the twins had co-occurring reading disabilities. So if one had a reading disability and 68% of them, the other one either would have or have reading deficits. And that means that the likelihood of having a reading disorder, a reading disability, is much higher if it runs in your family. However, the genes don't act alone. The role of environment and instruction is critical in individuals at risk for disabilities. Because if it acted alone, then more like 80 or 90% of the children who were identical twins would all have reading disabilities. And so environment seems to play a large factor in it. Then you also have the quantitative trait loci. And this is a theory that a number of genes may work together in an additive manner to influence reading ability. And the book lists some different genes that could be potential genes for reading disabilities, but the research is just not clear yet on one specific gene or even a QTL of genes that could potentially be related to reading disabilities or alone. Everything seems to be influencing the other. So it's there seem to be some differences, but not enough research to substantiate what genetic differences there are. And when you're thinking about genetic differences versus neurological differences, all of those causes are biological in nature. A gene would have more potential for gene therapy and gene identification versus neurological causes that goes into more of the cognitive behavioral sciences and brain sciences, brain studies. So that's really the difference between the genetic causes of reading versus neurological. So early on, Orton said that individuals with reading disabilities show less left dominance for language than normal readers, and the evidence does seem to support this, but is it a cause or an effect of the reading disability? There have been studies that show that the brains of individuals with dyslexia, the temporal plana, were symmetrical, and typically the temporal plana, I think I'm saying that right, but it could be plana, phonetics. The temporal plana is typically smaller in the left hemisphere in typical reading than, but in the dyslexia they were symmetrical, but it was mostly due in larger part to a large right planum. So it wasn't that the left planum was larger, the right was larger, causing the left to be symmetrical. Some other differences involved identified in the brain as potential neurological causes are differences in the regions of the temporal lobe, corpus callosum, inferior parietal lobe, and the cerebellum. So lots of different regions of the brain that could be potentially affecting reading disabilities. Again, the causes are these differences rather causes of dyslexia or reading disabilities, or the result of the reading disabilities? In other words, did they not develop because they weren't developing because the reading disability was there? So what are some neural systems involved in reading? There's the dorsal system or temporoparietal, and that involves phonological processing. There's the ventral system or occipitotemporal, occipitotemporal. That's the processing of visual words. And then there's the frontal, which is the inferior frontal gyrus, the effortful phonological decoding. So these are all systems that have been identified in and that are being used in reading. But there have shown differences in the activations of systems in dyslexics. So dyslexics show less activation than controls in the mid to posterior temporal cortex bilaterally, and in the left and inferior parietal cortex during reading and phonological processing tasks. Essentially, different areas of the brain are activated in children that have dyslexia than children who do not have reading disabilities, or individuals in general, not necessarily just children. Then children with reading disabilities demonstrated reduced cortical activity in some studies, but also they were able to observe changes in the cortical activity after an intervention was given. So essentially that's saying that an intervention could improve individuals' neurological activity and essentially reading performance, and change the patterns of the brain if the intervention was appropriate and successful. Also, when you're looking at neurological causes, the areas that they're finding in children with reading disabilities or dyslexia are different from the lesions, different areas of the brain than the lesions found in acquired reading disabilities. Those would be individuals who had reading disabilities as a result of a CVA, cardiovascular accident. So that indicates that it's not necessarily consistent between adults and children acquired reading disabilities versus the reading disabilities that have always been there since birth. And then also finally, infants in at-risk families do show different neural responses to auditory stimuli than typically developed infants. But this research is very new, and again, we need more research to be conducted to know the complete implications of neurological causes of dyslexia. All right, so looking at visually based errors or deficits. So because initially reading was thought to be a visual process, they've looked at how visual problems could cause reading disabilities. So considering reversal errors, these errors, when you look at the studies and the research, they don't occur more often in children with reading disabilities. It may seem like it's occurring more often in children with reading disabilities because they are older. And so when a child gets to second grade and they're not reading as fluently as well as their peers, and they're still doing reversals, that is viewed as not age appropriate. But if you compare them to their same reading level peers, maybe in kindergarten, the patterns are essentially the same. So errors don't occur more often in children with reading disabilities. The children with RD could accurately copy the words that they were presented, and they're more likely to have difficulties remembering the order of letters and words when you see these reversal errors rather than actually being able to copy the words as they are seen. And then there's this proposal of erratic eye movements. So there's saccades eye movement for reading, which involves a series of rapid jerks. It appears that we're reading very smoothly, but we're not. our eyes are actually rapidly moving in jerks throughout the across the page to read the words and the letters. And I don't know about you, whenever I start talking about this, I start becoming very cognizant of what my eyes are doing and trying to see if I can feel my eye jerks. And I don't, but it's just one of those things that you start thinking about whenever you learn about this activity. So there have been noted differences in fixations, saccades, and regressions in children with reading disabilities, but this could be a reflection of the cognitive processing and difficulties in RD. So essentially, if it takes more time for you to read a word because it's a more linguistically loaded or cognitively difficult word, that doesn't mean you have a visual processing deficit. More so, it's the cognitive load that's making you making up the difference in your saccades. Most of professionals agree that oculomotor exercise and behavioral optometry have little to offer in the treatment of reading disabilities. And it kind of goes into that argument of oral motor movements and exercises and how those non-speech movements and exercises have little to do with improving speech intelligibility. I feel this falls into the same category. I'm not familiar enough with oculomotor exercises, but I do know that there are some programs out there by optometrists proposing that they can essentially cure dyslexia and reading disabilities by placing children in a prone position and moving a light back and forth in front of their eyes for them to track. And that seems to fit that oculomotor exercise category, and falls into that if it's too good to be true adage. It probably is, but I think it's significant to note that because you might have some people in your area who are pursuing this type of therapy, visual processing type therapy for reading disabilities, and there doesn't seem to be any link in the evidence and research to visual processing and reading disabilities. Then there's, I misspelled it, scotopic sensitivity syndrome. And you're probably not necessarily familiar with the syndrome, but you're probably familiar with the therapy for it. This is the oversensitivity to particular frequencies of light. And so this first proposed the use of color lenses and overlays. So I'm sure you've all heard of the colored overlays for children with dyslexia. However, there is also little evidence to link SSS and reading disabilities, even though it was essentially all the rage in the mid-90s and late 80s, early 90s, that there were lots of products based on this theory that if you change the color of things, then that would take away the reading disability. But essentially, the evidence doesn't support that. Then you have transient processing deficits, and essentially there are two visual processing systems. The transient system is sensitive to global visual features. The sustained system responds to fine detail and is used in visual feature identification. So individuals with reading disabilities may have sluggish transient systems. They have found they have sluggish transient systems. But this occurs in concert with phonological processing deficits. So you can't eliminate that phonological component when you're making considerations for transient processing deficits. Okay. And finally, before we get to language-based, auditory processing deficits and attention-based deficits. Of course, you're all familiar with auditory processing disorders, or APD. In theory, that the deficits in auditory perception, especially problems in perceiving rapidly occurring or changing sounds, leads to poor phonological representations and difficulties in phonological awareness and reading. However, the evidence doesn't support this, but it could be due to a lack of reliability and validity of auditory processing measures or individual differences. There's also a lack of sensitivity to syllable-level prosodic information in speech that could negatively affect phonological awareness development. So essentially there's some components there that they do perform poorer, but the the validity of auditory processing measures is not as strong as you would like it to be, empirically speaking. And it could still be linked to, these deficits could still be linked to phonological awareness deficits and development. And this is essentially a theory around the fast-forward approach to dyslexia therapy or to reading disabilities. So one of your groups has a fast-forward article analyzing improvements in children with language and reading ability, a longitudinal study with fast-forward. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that. And then auditory ADHD deficits, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One study found that 36% of ADHD children had reading disabilities, and subsequently 15% of reading disabled children had ADHD. And there was a stronger overlap for inattention type symptoms of inattention rather than symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. So there is some overlap, but because ADHD, as we discussed last semester, is so subjective and so depends on the observational data that you're collecting, you really can't say that ADHD is causing reading disability, but it can co-occur with reading disability. And you have to make the contention or the argument that if a child is severely ADHD and misses the primary instructional period for reading in kindergarten and first grade, that by the time they get to second grade and they're diagnosed with ADHD, and the behavioral modifications or prescriptive therapeutic methods, whatever is chosen to be done with that child to meet their needs, if no one ever goes back and addresses those missed skills due to the behavioral issues we were having, the child's going to have reading problems. So their consideration needs to be given that if you have a child with these types of symptoms, are we getting the adequate instructional exposure that every other child is getting who has normal attentive behaviors and abilities? So finally, language-based deficits, of course. This book is written by a speech-language pathologist. It's called Language and Reading Disabilities, so it is going to take the theoretical stance that reading disabilities are language-based. And so I'm going to present this, but if you feel like it's you fall on another side of an argument for the causes of reading disabilities, by all means. There's a lot of research out there that they discussed extensively about different causes of reading disabilities. So language-based. Children with language impairment are more likely to have reading disabilities. So what do language problems in poor readers look like? And it doesn't mean that most children with reading disabilities have a history of LI. Is it a cause or a consequence? Poor readers' early language deficits extend beyond vocabulary, grammar, and narration to phonological awareness and phonological retrieval in kindergarten. Now, these are obviously the poor readers that have when the mixed deficit they referred to earlier. So not dyslexics, but poor readers, they have the mixed reading comprehension deficit and decoding deficit. And they had the deficits across the board in language, and the phonological awareness and phonological retrieval component would contribute to the decoding deficits they have. 45% of these children perform poorly on tests of phonological retrieval, which is rapid naming, such as naming letters or naming colors or naming numbers. Poor comprehenders show deficits in expressive and receptive vocabulary knowledge, have less well-specified semantic representations, difficulties in grammar and syntax skills, and difficulties in text-level language. The deficits in non-phonological aspects of language can be observed prior to the onset of reading instruction in children who will become poor comprehenders. So the grammar, syntax skills, vocabulary knowledge. Poor comprehenders may also have deficits in executive functioning and or attention. So those are all those metacognitive skills that we've discussed before as well. When it comes to phonological awareness, children with reading disabilities have difficulty in phonological processing, including phonological awareness. And PA is the explicit awareness of or sensitivity to the sound structure of speech, one's ability to attend to, reflect on, or manipulate the speech, sounds, and words. They have, again, children with RD have difficulty with PA. They must be taught phonological awareness due to its abstract nature. It's very metalinguistic, thinking about language. The phonological awareness difficulties are apparent in at-risk children prior to reading instruction, and it is the best predictor in kindergarten of word recognition in second grade. And you could call it a co-requisite to learning to read. Essentially, that not a prerequisite. It's occurring as reading knowledge and acquisition is occurring. Phonological retrieval. That is naming difficulties that are due to problems in remembering phonological information. Naming deficits are likely due to retrieval problems and word-finding tasks. And you have rapid naming or rapid automatic naming tasks, often referred to as RAN. This requires an individual to quickly and automatically say the name of a series of letters, numbers, familiar objects, or colors. And the self has some RAN activities in the dyslexia screener. That is a required component. In addition to the phonological awareness, you must have a rapid automatic naming task. And the DIBELS reading assessments that I discussed last semester, the letter naming component would be considered a rapid automatic naming task, how quickly they can name that word. And again, I spoke at the beginning of the lecture about their ability to rapidly retrieve names, puts less taxation on the memory and for them to be able to retrieve the lexical and linguistic knowledge they need to read the word. So the more you have to identify the letter, the name, the sound, that's the more load of the working memory and the less that they're going to comprehend. So children with reading disabilities have slower RANs. It explains the variance in reading achievement beyond phonological awareness. Children could have a double deficit in just phonological awareness, deficit in just rapid automatic naming, or deficit in both. And this rapid automatic naming involves accessing a phonological code as well as intentional, perceptual, memory, lexical, and articulatory processes. And I have a student this year who was tested, and he was real language as well as specific learning disability. He's been on our radar for about a year, and his biggest difficulty was color words, retrieving the names of color words. He was not colorblind because you give him the color blindness test and about tell me the number or letter or picture that you see, and he would pass that. And he would sometimes be able to recall the color words correctly, but not consistently. He was terrible at letter naming on DIBELS. He could do non-word reading tasks at the grade level expectation, which he was, although he was a year behind age level. And you couldn't you couldn't say, well, he doesn't know it because he hasn't been instructed in it, because, or rather, you couldn't say that he was really struggling because his instructional level was only that of a kindergartner, even if he was a 6-year-old child. And so we tested, and he's one of those children that I felt really wasn't language impaired, but just to be safe, we're going to serve for a little while and then dismiss later, because he pretty much can do all the tasks therapeutically that I give him, but he automatically fits this category of phonological retrieval. It's not just color words, but just retrieval of names. And it talks about the characteristics of these children. They can do better semantic describing. It's not the word finding, rather, but it's the retrieval of the phonological features of the word. And this fits him to a T. He is a child who has severe difficulties in phonological retrieval, which significantly contributed to his ability to learn how to read. Okay. Then there's phonological memory, also known as phonological coding. It's the encoding and storage of phonological information in memory. It's assessed by memory span tasks involving meaningful or non-meaningful strings of verbal items. Poor readers have problems using phonological memory codes to store verbal information. Dyslexics make errors in non-word repetition tasks. So as we talked about before, that children with SLI have difficulties in non-words, so do dyslexic children. So there's an overlap there in this particular area of phonology. And then reading disabilities have deficiencies in the quality of the phonological representations. So Kennedy was trying to say successful, and she's missing it. She's got one top tooth coming in, and she's missing the other top tooth. And definitely since those teeth have been lost, we have a little bit more difficulty in saying these complex phonological words. And successful, she was really struggling with. But of course, it's this, and then it's the front S, then the back K, and then the front S again. It can be a tongue twister without having teeth missing, and then you lose those teeth. So, and that's appropriate for a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, not necessarily appropriate for a 10-year-old to be struggling with that. And the book gives good examples of the phonological memory and phonological production tasks that the children have difficulty with. Okay, then phonological production. Speech production abilities have been linked to reading disabilities. It could be due to problems in the phonological memory, like we were speaking about in the last section. The deficits in speech planning may contribute to speech production problems in individuals with reading disabilities, but not all children with speech sound disorders have reading disabilities. The reading disabilities related to the severity of the speech sound disorder, other language abilities, and the level of phonological awareness. I have one that had a really severe speech sound disorder at 4 years old. He did ESY with me last year, and I've treated him all of kindergarten. He always had good phonological awareness. He always had good overall language abilities, with the exception of dropping of plurals and past tense due to dialect and the phonological process of final consonant deletion. He's resolved almost all of his errors in his speech, but he really is a great reader too. And his teacher was just amazed. She said, even given all of his speech deficits, of how well he was reading. So he was a good example of a child with severe speech sound disorder, phonological processing, that didn't meet the criteria for reading disability, thankfully. But the children with severe speech sound disorders and broad-based language impairments who perform poorly on phonological awareness are the most at risk for the reading disabilities. So is language a cause or a consequence? They are definitely closely associated with reading disabilities. Sometimes language impairment precedes and is causally linked to reading disabilities. But language problems will be a major component of all cases of reading disabilities, even if it's not the cause, even if it doesn't precede. Language problems will manifest themselves later whenever their vocabulary growth slows due to their lack of reading and exposure. So language will need to be addressed in intervention regardless of cause or consequence.